Hey everyone, and welcome back to my class review series where I level up each class in the game, I gear them up, and then I share my thoughts and experiences with you. Today we're going to be looking at the Death Knight. They of course received a broad overhaul in Legion, certainly something that long-time Death Knights are probably used to, especially in the early days of Wrath and Cataclysm, where Blizzard were still trying to work out what the game's first hero class would actually be. Now that Legion has been out for a decent while, let's just see where they've settled and what they're like to play. Starting off with the Frost Death Knight. So Frost, I imagine, is the first Death Knight spec that most people will be trying out. It overall is one of the easier specs to get into due to its relatively simple mechanics and ability execution. Now, mastering it isn't really that hard either, though there is a decent bit of thought and planning involved in getting the ideal Breath of Sindragosa usage, which is a pretty cool little mechanic that I'll be covering just a little bit later on in this section of the video. Now, at its core, Frost is a punchy melee spec that basically boils down to you reacting to procs well, spreading a simple disease, and then just the management of your resources. The pace of gameplay is what I would describe as really moderate. It certainly is not very fast-paced, even when you do get a bit more gear on you, but it's certainly not what I would say is slow. It is quite methodical, I suppose, overall, and I guess if you're someone who'd be gravitating to maybe a Windwalker monk, then it wouldn't be the gameplay feel that you're after, but if you like a sort of a big, punchy, slow walking dude with a big sword, well, two big swords in this case, then it's probably for you. Now, I'm going to be doing the gameplay explainers as a kind of live walkthrough this time around, so let's hop in game and take a look at how it plays. Okay, so here we are on my Frost Death Knight in the gameplay section of the video. So it's the first time I've done one of these. Basically, I want to give you a live sort of walkthrough of the very basics of the spec. The idea is that this isn't a guide, this is just so that everyone can be brought up to speed about roughly how the class plays, because the intention of the class review series is to introduce people to classes that they may not have seen played or maybe haven't played themselves. So, with the Death Knight, I'm just going to walk up to this guy. So, you can see, here are my 6 runes as displayed on my UI. Runes are your first resource. Your second one is then runic power. Whenever you spend a rune on something like Obliterate, which costs 2 runes, you'll generate runic power, and then that runic power can be spent on a number of abilities. Now, let's just talk about our abilities that cost runes. There's Howling Blast. This basically does some damage, and more importantly, it puts Frost Fever on the target. Pretty simple, you just want to maintain Frost Fever. We've then got Remorseless Winter. This just causes an AoE around you. It also looks really damn cool indeed. And yeah, that costs 1 rune. You want to generally keep that up. And then we've got Obliterate. This, you just pummel the target with both your weapons. It costs 2 runes, and you can see that right now it's got a proc. That proc is called Killing Machine, and that causes your next Obliterate usage to be a guaranteed critical strike. Now, there is one more proc that I do need to show you, and there we go. This is Rhyme, which gives you a free instant 300% bonus damage use of Howling Blast, which is pretty damn good. I'm just going to move away from this because, this Unholy Death Knight seems to be going quite ham. Anyway, so a lot of the gameplay is basically about using those procs in the correct way once they pop up, and then also, just not maxing out your resources and stuff like that. Now, one thing that I will mention a little bit more in the video, but I do want to show you how it plays here, is Breath of Sindragosa. This is the most viable talent that most people are using, and basically it does continuous damage in a frontal cone around you. It's got a 2-minute cooldown, and it costs 15 runic power per second, so that's the same runic power that I'm generating right now when I'm spamming Obliterates. Now, I'm actually, let's just go right into it. I'm just going to wait until a few of those runes regenerate, just so I can give you a good example of it. So we're going to use Breath of Sindragosa like that. You can see all those sort of cool effects going out around me, and now I'm trying to maintain my, oh, I forgot to use Pillar of Frost, that was silly. I'm trying to maintain the amount of runic power that I have so that this Breath of Sindragosa lasts for as long as possible, and I find that to be a really satisfying little gameplay loop that's, it's just fun to challenge yourself, see how far, how long you can make it last, stuff like that, and it's definitely very rewarding in a raiding scenario when you do a pretty good job and make it last for a while. Looks like mine's just ended there, probably not the best usage, but hey, that's roughly what it's looking like. Also, our artifact ability is awesome. Sindragosa's Fury. Take a look at this. Boom! Big dragon goes, hurts everything. Overall, that's a very quick look to give you an understanding of how it plays. Now, one area where they do kind of fall down for me is movement, and this is something that really is across the specs, and it does come down to personal preference. So look, as a Fury Warrior, I can charge to places, I can leap around the place. As a Monk, I can roll, I can use Rushing Jade Wind. As a Demon Hunter, I can Fell Rush. As a Death Knight, I slowly plod about the place. Their thinking is that, you're such an unstoppable force, you can calmly saunter about the place, but in practice, I have found it to feel limiting. Now, we do somewhat make up for that with Death Grip, which is fantastic and really fun as always, and some really useful utility like Anti-Magic Shield, but yeah, the lack of movement definitely does feel odd based on the other classes that I've played. Now, the moment-to-moment gameplay, I'd say overall here, is very much helped as well by its animations and sound effects. They absolutely nail the fantasy of this spec, and it just does have this really menacing vibe. So it's great that the art team managed to deliver on that. Overall, I'd say this spec does quite well for me, but not fantastically. I would rather play Fury Warrior, a Windwalker Monk, or a Havoc Demon Hunter. Frost has a solid yet slightly uninteresting core rotation that is bolstered by one really fun talent build and some really fantastic work with the look and the feel. I do think that it is a spec that has a good broad appeal though, and that it's therefore one that will suit quite a lot of players. Alright, so Unholy. Now this one it's just the polar opposite of Frost in so many ways. Where Frost is simple, Unholy, well, Unholy is not at all, and that is both a major strength and a major weakness for it. In some ways, it's what I would call a target dummy spec. A spec that's really fun to play when you're focusing on playing your character. You're sitting there at a target dummy trying to execute the rotation perfectly, and it's really enjoyable, but then maybe it's a little bit too distracting and involved if you're in a really high-octane boss fight where you'd rather be focusing on your teammates and the mechanics of the encounter. It's another example of that tricky situation between balancing a spec difficulty. Of all the specs that I've played, this is towards the more complex end, but it's not like it does insane damage. So if you have a more, a spec with more accessible gameplay and consistent performance with, say, Frost, why bother with Unholy? It's, it's a tricky one for the class design team to work around, but regardless of all of that, I really, really do appreciate what they've done with the Unholy Death Knight. Their recommitment towards class fantasy with Legion has worked out great for Unholy, which right now has a really unique feeling, and it's got mechanics that are really strong thematically and just really satisfying to play with. So let's hop in and take a look at how it plays. Okay, time for the Unholy Death Knight gameplay. So let's just start whacking this target. You'll notice, first of all, our runes, resources, etc. are pretty much the same as they were last time. Now, I'm going to ignore this proc in my Death Coil and give you a basic overview of how this plays. So, Festering Strike costs 2 runes, and the important thing you need to know about that, if I just use it right now, you can see that it applies between 2 and 4 Festering Wounds, and you can see that just above this target here. Now, Festering Wounds get popped normally by Scourge Strike. Right now I'm using something slightly different called Clawing Shadows that replaces it, but it's the same idea. So Clawing Shadows costs 1 rune, deals a bunch of shadow damage, and causes 1 Festering Wound to burst. And you might be thinking, why do I want a Festering Wound to burst? Well, when a Festering Rune bursts, it generates runic power and does damage. So the basic idea here is that we want to be applying Festering Wounds to the target, and then we want to be popping those wounds using Clawing Shadows. Now, at the same time, when you're doing all of that, of course, you're spending runes, which is giving you runic power. So you bleed off your extra runic power using Death Coil. Now, I've just procced a free Death Coil. It's not always free, but because of some of the talents and stuff like that are involved here, there's a little bit more specific gameplay. Now, I'm just going to summon my dead dude due to one of my talents. This is an Abomination instead. As a sample of one of my cooldowns, Dark Transformation will make him big and stompy, which is pretty cool indeed. We also have Outbreak. This just applies a Virulent Plague to the target. That's really all you need to know. Now, you'll notice that when I use Death Coil, I get an effect called Necrosis, which causes my next Scourge Strike, and I believe that also affects Clawing Shadows, to do extra damage. So then a part of the gameplay that creates is, you're applying a Festering Wound like this, but then you want to weave in Death Coil, Clawing Shadows, Death Coil, Clawing Shadows, so that you're benefiting the extra damage there. And really, this sort of gameplay and managing those resources is the core of how this spec works. And it's definitely something that I do think is very fun and very engaging, but it's definitely a little bit more involved than, say, what we would have seen with Frost. Now, Just to give you another example of a talent that a lot of people use that's very powerful, but that does require a decently high amount of skill to actually use right, is Soul Reaper. So it costs 1 rune, and it puts a debuff on the target for 5 seconds. Each festering wound that you pop in that 5 seconds will give you a stacking buff that stacks up to 3 times, which gives you 7% haste per stack. So ideally you want to use this, and then go and use 3, say, Clawing Shadows in a row, and you can now see that my character has 21 haste for the next 12 seconds. So if you've got both the Necrosis talent and the Soul Reaper talent, you're managing the weaving of your Death Coils and Clawing Shadows in with the extra gameplay of ensuring that you're getting the most use out of Soul Reaper, and then all the time, you've still got to manage your Festering Wound stacks and all of that stuff. So as you can see, it certainly is a pretty involved spec in the grand scheme of things. Finally, I'm just going to cover Apocalypse, which is our artifact ability. So basically, this will smash up to 6 Festering Wounds on the target, and it will summon a Army of the Dead Ghoul for each one that it bursts. So if I just quickly go up here and put a whole bunch of those on, then use Apocalypse, you can see, boom, did a bunch of damage, popped a bunch of wounds. Now I've got a bunch of these wee guys, and of course, because I popped 6 Festering Wounds, that gave me a big influx of runic power, which obviously I'm capping now because I'm just sort of focusing on explaining stuff to you in the video, but really that's most of how this spec plays. Overall, I think it's very fun indeed, though it's definitely one that does take a little bit more getting used to, but of course, for the right player, that really will be a lot of engaging depth and a great benefit. So as you can see, there are a fair few things to manage with this spec. You, of course, need to manage basically 3 resources as a baseline, and then manage the optimal usage of a number of other mechanics. And then many things involve your Festering Wound stacks, and that's something that you need to plan in advance. So it's a spec that does reward you for really thinking a few seconds ahead. And what this means is that mistakes can compound upon themselves, which messes up timings and leads to a situation where it kind of all falls apart. That is the downside of the spec, but the upside of the spec is that you are presented with really cool, really unique mechanics that really do just complement the theme of the spec and are just really fun to play with. Then the talent tree for this adds a whole bunch of mechanical headroom as well. You've got things like Soul Reaper and Necrosis, which further reinforce careful planning and usage of your resources. Now, what can be lost here is the ability to, say, walk up to an enemy and just whack it in the face till it's dead. I mean, you do literally do that, but there's a little bit more setup with, you know, putting on your Festering Wounds and stuff like that, which means that it's a spec that does feel better to play if you're, say, doing a raid fight where it actually lasts for a while. It can feel a little bit of a chore in world content. Certainly, you know, if I'm doing world content, I'd rather play Frost. It's just one of those things where it's tricky being more of a, you know, a dot or setup class in comparison to something like a Demon Hunter or a Fury Warrior. So to conclude with Unholy, yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's got its pros and its cons, but overall, I think it's a really rewarding and fun spec to play. Okay, next we've got Blood. I've had a bit of a strange experience with the Blood Death Knight. It wasn't, I wasn't really a fan at first sight, but I've really warmed to it the more that I've played it. Blood Death Knights are a tank spec that are heavily focused on self-heals, and this is one of the reasons why they are pretty much legendary when it comes to soloing content. Like, just look at some of Myon's work, if you want to see that, like soloing, soloing Legion raid bosses and stuff. Anyway, I think that it's easiest just to hop right into the gameplay section for these guys, so let's go. Alright, so let's take a look at Blood Death Knight gameplay. So, first of all, it's pretty much, your normal rune system, combined with runic power. So whenever you spend runes, you'll get runic power. And basically the way that things work is that Blood Boil is going to apply Blood Plague to your enemy. Then Death Strike will do some damage, but more importantly, Death Strike will heal you up, and it actually works in a very cool way indeed. It heals you for 20% of all damage taken in the last 5 seconds, but with a minimum of 10% of your maximum health. So it always gives you a chunky heal, but if you try to space them out and make use of that 5-second window, you'll be able to get quite a lot of heals. We then have Heart Strike. This is pretty great just for doing damage, getting some runic power, little bit of a heal due to some talents as well. Overall, it's kind of like a bit of a filler in a way, but it still is very important how the spec plays. We've then got Marrow Rend. Now, Marrow Rend is quite important indeed. It does a fair chunk of damage. It costs 2 runes, but what's really great about it is Bone Shield. So, Bone Shield, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and show you what Bone Shield is like. So I just got 4 stacks of it, and if I read it up here, you can see damage taken is reduced by 16%, haste is increased by 10%. Now if you look at my maximum health here, the second I use it, boom, my max health goes up. Now that's pretty important because, as an example, Death Strike heals based off a percentage of your max health, and that's what a Death Strike heal is kind of like. So the idea with this spec really is that you're using your Heart Strikes to get rid of runes to generate runic power so that you can optimally use Death Strikes while maintaining a Bone Shield through the Marrow Rend ability, and that really is a lot of the core defensive toolkit. Now, of course, you're spreading Blood Boil, you're spreading Blood Plague to your opponents via Blood Boil, and then if you're in an AoE situation, you can pop down Death and Decay just like that, pretty easy. That said, you do have a thing which can proc a free usage of Death and Decay, which is quite useful in single target situations. And another nice thing about having Death and Decay up, and you can see I just got that proc that I mentioned, and I'm actually just going to go over to these normal guys to show you what it's like. So I've put the Death and Decay down, but while I'm in a Death and Decay, you can see that my Heart Strike actually has a little bit of a spread to it, which is pretty sweet. I think I was out of range there, but yeah, as you can see, it's hitting multiple targets, so that's pretty damn cool indeed. Let's go over to this dungeon tank thing. Just using the dungeon one because it's quite handy and that it won't kill me instantly while I'm sitting here talking to you. Now, we do have some cool talents and things like that. We've got Blood Drinker, does a lot of damage, actually drains health from the target, and you can see I'm getting healed right up while that's actually being active. And what's cool about this is sometimes between the healing that you're getting from your Death Strikes and your Heart Strikes and all of that stuff, and then things like Blood Drinker and Consumption, which I'll talk about in a second, you really do have great self-sustain. Looking at Consumption, basically it's a cleave. So if I take a bunch of damage here, you can see if I go up to, say, these guys and use Consumption, it's a frontal cleave, does a whole bunch of damage. More importantly, you get healed for 100% of that damage. So, boom, and you get a massive self-heal. And a lot of that really is how the core of this spec plays. You are very tanky, you're also very self-heal based. We've got things like our Death Grip, obviously not really going to work in a target like this. Awesome things like Gorfiend's Grasp, which, again, isn't really going to work in these guys, but Gorfiend's Grasp, you've probably seen it, pulls everyone in towards you. Overall, really a fun toolkit, and I love this sort of self-healing gameplay. Alright, so as you guys know, with me and tanking's like a bit of a side hobby, right? And it's something that I mainly enjoy for Mythic Plus dungeons. So do take my thoughts here with a pinch of salt. There are times where there's a tank spec which seems to be thought of as being quite dull, like a Prot Warrior, that I still really enjoy playing because I just inherently enjoy the activity of tanking. Now, with that out of the way, I think that with the Blood DK, some of the core abilities they're a bit, I don't mean literally weak, but they're just a bit boring. Stuff like Blood Boil, Heart Strike, Marrow Rend, they're not that fun or unique feeling as abilities. They don't have great animations. It's just, it's a bit boring. But what does work is the self-healing gameplay. So while some of the abilities themselves are a bit dull, the kind of meta game and layer of gameplay on top of all of that, surrounding keeping yourself alive via self-heals, is really fun. So you're maintaining your Bone Shield, and then you're managing your resources for optimal Death Strike usage, while keeping in mind any periods of large incoming damage, and of course, like keeping tabs on all your major cooldowns and things like that. Now, for me, this self-healing stuff is a fun little mini-game that's actually super engaging, and more exciting to me than, say, the active mitigation mechanics of, like a Prot Warrior. Really, it does feel like the sort of the pinnacle of like the self-healing gameplay as far as fun goes. Now, I know that Vengeance does have a lot of self-heals as well, but it's in a more simplistic and less engaging way than what it's like with the Blood DK. Now, that said, Vengeance does benefit from being able to leap about the place, which, once again, is something that I really do miss when playing as a Blood Death Knight. Of course, we make up for that. We have our Death Grip, and then we've got Gorfiend's Grasp, which is just invaluable in dungeons and raids. You can just use that to hoover everyone up and create a beautiful big death ball for your DPS to cleave through. Now, I think the Blizzard do need to do better work on the look and feel of this spec. It's just, in my view, kind of weak overall, but you do feel like an unstoppable force with your massive health pool, your big self-heals, and yeah, it's just a pity you don't really look great while you're doing it. But overall, I think it's a very strong entry to the tanks, and it's one that I really do enjoy playing a hell of a lot due to just the inherent fun of this self-heal mechanic. But yeah, I do think that, so in spite of some of their abilities being rather boring and the visuals being weak, it's got some very strong gameplay loops involved with it. So it does get pretty much a really big thumbs up from me with a few reservations, and bear in mind this is me talking about personal experience and fun, not talking about raid viability. So let's just talk broadly about the pros and cons then, my experience with the DK. Overall, I think they do quite well. You've got a tank spec that works really well and absolutely has its strong suits, gameplay-wise. You've got two great DPS specs, which each have their own niche. The visuals are pretty much brilliant, bar the blood stuff. Your artifacts are pretty cool, your class order hall's really cool as well. The campaign gets a bit strange towards the end, but it's a very cool concept that really does nail the whole Death Knight power fantasy as well. The class identity overall is just super strong and really kind of fun to engage with. And then, of course, the handiness of having a direct portal to your order hall is just amazing. Now, that said, people who are used to lots of movement mechanics might feel, well, kind of neutered if you're playing a Demon or a Death Knight, to be honest. Moving forward, I think I would like to see Blizzard do some work on the ability set of Blood, but to sort of keep the core self-healing mechanic, because I think that's extremely fun. Unholy and Frost are super strong, and I'd be happy with them to just sort of keep on going as they have been with Legion. Personally, though, I think I do prefer my Havoc Demon Hunter, my Fury Warrior, or my Elemental Shaman, so I don't think I'll be investing that much time in the Death Knight past doing this video. That's less because the Death Knight is bad, it certainly isn't, and it's more because there's just a few other specs which I particularly do love playing. So they have been my thoughts on the Death Knight. Of course, they're just mine. I'm dead keen to hear what you've got to say about the Death Knight, especially if you're a more experienced player and you've actually been playing this thing for months and months, as opposed to the, sort of a month, few weeks that I've been doing it. So that's it for this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.